He had hired people to solve problems his life never asked him to feel. Numbers bent to his will. Projections sang obediently into neat columns. Daniel Winfred measured the world by inputs and outputs, by ratios and risk tolerance. He knew the cost of an outdated server, the turnover rate in a region, the price of silence when a public relations crisis could be contained. He did not, until that week in late October, know the cost of a borrowed apron or of a child's missed appointment. She had worked in his family's townhouses and later, for nearly 2 decades, in the glassed-out floor of the penthouse where he held meetings that decided millions. Rosa Alvarez moved through that tower like a secret current, always there, rarely asked about. Her sleeves were patched but clean. Her hands carried the faint smell of lemon and floor wax. She had a laugh that came in small, guarded bursts. Daniel had seen her from distance for 12 years. The stoop she polished, the coat she folded in exact order, the way she straightened a crooked painting as if mending the world itself. The anomalies were small at first, the sort of details a man who tracked margins would have dismissed if he treated people like spreadsheets. Rosa had asked for a salary advancement, twice, and she had explained it away with a soft, practical phrase that might have been true for any household worker. Unexpected school books, a late utility. Then she began to leave the building later than usual on Tuesdays, returning at odd hours with an exhausted near stumble that she hid under a practiced, polite smile. Once a manager mentioned casually that she had been seen at the Southside Clinic. Daniel heard the words and felt a tightening in his chest, the same physical reaction he had once felt when a product line underperformed. Annoyance, then curiosity, then irritation at being left to wonder. He was a man who solved puzzles. Following was, in his world, a legitimate method of inquiry. The firing did not come as drama. It happened with the antiseptic economy of corporate decisions made by email and a text, but the moment of it arrived as blunt and personal. Robert Hall, his head of human resources, approached him in mid-morning with a file and a neutral look that had been trained for difficult conversations. An absent-minded mistake, Robert said. Rosa had been late again. Her hours log showed multiple discrepancies. They had already issued 2 written warnings. Margaret Chin, the CFO, in another message, had flagged labor inefficiencies and the need for stricter enforcement of attendance in private households to control overhead. There was language about precedent and protecting the household. Daniel signed the termination. He told himself it was a line item, that the company, his home, could not be a place of exceptions. The signature was small on his tablet, a habitual motion, and then the thing was done. A clean, professional severance packet prepared by Patricia Green, his lawyer, with phrases meant to cushion the blow. He had not watched the person he was firing. He had not needed to. Later that afternoon, when the junior assistant delivered Rosa's things in a discreet box, a set of folded dish towels, a chipped mug with a small chip at the rim she refused to replace in the shop where they bought tissue, a folded scarf that smelled faintly of her son's cologne. Daniel felt a first unfamiliar heat beneath his collar that had nothing to do with HR policy. The scarf should have been trivial. He squinted at the mug and the folded towel, at the neat way the box had been packed. Someone had hand-tied the string on the brown paper. The thought that it had been her hands made his stomach turn. He told himself he had acted on principle. That night, in a penthouse that glimmered with curated absence, polished wood, a view of lights that seemed to exist without consequence, he replayed the day. He told himself that standards were standards, and that his decisions hit nothing but the necessary wind. He told himself that he did not know. It was the small things that told him otherwise. He found a wooden chess pawn on the marble coffee table when he came down to the living room for water at 2 in the morning. He could have sworn he'd put nothing there. The pawn was crude and varnished. Someone had carved it by hand. Maybe a child's toy, he thought. He turned it over between his thumb and index finger, noticing the faint groove on the base as if from being rubbed to pieces by habit. He had a dozen medals and a dozen reminders of a life of calculated risk. This pawn was not an apparatus of measurement. It was a worn token, held to something private. The pawn lodged in him like a question. The next morning he asked the assistant who had boxed Rosa's things. The assistant, who had always looked at the staff with a certain conditioned blindness, said flatly that the house had followed procedure. There was a mention of the clinic again. That afternoon, Daniel asked his driver to reroute past the Southside Clinic out of curiosity, a phrase that sounded ridiculous as soon as it left his mouth. The driver, a man who had an unremarkable loyalty to schedules, hummed and did as he was told. Rosa left the building at noon. She hugged the scarf to her chest like a secret. She moved slow and careful in the autumn air, the city doing its ordinary work around her. Vans hissing, a street vendor folding up a cart, someone dropping a paper cup that bounced along a curb. Daniel watched from his car as she disappeared into the flow of the subway entrance, the world swallowing her in its normal indifference. He told himself then what he'd tell himself in interviews later. He followed because he wanted to understand. He followed because he could. The subway came down like a dark throat. He rode 2 stops behind, marveling at how simple it was to pass unnoticed when he so often expected to be seen. Rosa rode holding a small nylon bag. Her hands were folded around the strap, her breath fogged in the carriage. When she stood to leave, he rose simultaneously, feeling unsteady, insecure without a chart that ordered what came next. He followed her up into a neighborhood that felt like a different city. Brick low-rises with children's bicycles chained to stoops, a pharmacy whose sign buzzed in pale LED. He watched as she entered a hospital, a name he did not recognize, through automatic doors that opened and closed on the world of arrival and waiting. People clutched magazines. A woman cradled an infant. The antiseptic smell was thin under the familiar sharp tang of cafeteria coffee. Daniel hovered by a pillar near the elevators. He was a man accustomed to corners and surveys and the power of watching. Watching was action to him in a way it was not to everyone. The oncology wing smelled faintly of hand lotion and bleach. The waiting room sign said Pediatrics Oncology Infusion Suite. He could have turned and left. Instead, he followed. He arrived at a room where a nurse with tired eyes adjusted tubing, and where a thin boy sat small in a big hospital chair, wrists looped with a paper bracelet. The boy had hair in thin tufts where the chemotherapy had not fully taken hold, but his face was bright with a stubbornness that did not belong to his small frame. He was playing with a wooden pawn, rolling it between his fingers. The pawn matched the one in Daniel's hand. Daniel realized then that the pawn had never been on his table. His pawn had been a compass home, dropped into his world by mistake and finding its reflection here. Rosa sat at the chair's side, throat vibrating as if containing an ocean. She did not look like someone who had been fired that morning. She looked like someone who had been busy staying alive. When she noticed Daniel, she did not lurch with shame. She met his eyes with a look that contained all at once exhaustion and the width of responsibilities you do not choose. Daniel had always thought that an appearance of control was enough. In 3 minutes, in the soft, fluorescent light of that hospital room, his illusions of competence unraveled into raw, uncalibrated feeling. "How is he?" he asked before he could stop himself. The question slipped out, not as a formal query, but as something small and human that could not be withheld. It made the room tilt. Rosa's voice was a low, guttural thing. "He's fighting," she said, and the words came as if through teeth. "He has leukemia. He is 15. He likes to win at chess." The boy, David, she said, smiled a small smile, showing a gap of bravery. The nurse complimented him on being brave. He shrugged as if to say bravery was just what you did when there was nowhere else to stand. He set the pawn back on the small folding table and made a move in an invisible game. Billing came up in the way it always did. Slow, archival, with a bureaucratic cruelty that attached itself to human bodies. The infusion center required pre-authorization, a note from a doctor, insurance coverage that had a waiting period. The clinic's social worker, efficient in the way trained people become when they have seen too much grief, explained the hurdles gently. Rosa's voice held steady as she recounted checkpoints. The social worker clicked through a screen and said, "There may be gap coverage for a month," and then softer, "But private pay items and some specialist consults are not covered without authorization." There were pauses in the conversation like empty rooms. There were amounts mentioned in round numbers that meant little to the people in the room until they meant everything. co-pays, deductibles, estimated out-of-pocket for a treatment cycle that could extend into months. Daniel listened to the jargon and found in that vocabulary of incomprehension the precise outline of a moral failure. The systems he had built to protect shareholders and streamline health benefits for executives did not, in the way they were designed, shelter the people who cleaned their floors. He had a hand in making the rules that let gaps exist at all. Rosa said, "We were paying the bills as we could. We sold things. We borrowed from my sister. We waited for the insurance to kick in. The clinic says they can start some treatments, but there are tests and consults that are held up for clearance. Sometimes they say to start now, and sometimes to wait." She held David's hand, and her fingers trembled just slightly when she spoke. There was no pleading in her voice, only a list of options that had been exhausted one by one. The fact that he had fired her that morning, he remembered the crisp tone of Patricia's email, the polite phrases, arrived in him like a physical blow. He had authorized dismissal in a meeting and minutes later sat across a thin woman who had been doing for years the labor that kept his life smooth. The dissonance was unbearable. He felt an ethical gravity he had never acknowledged in the boardroom. He felt small in a way his rituals and forecasts never prepared him for. He could have stepped away. He could have delegated outrage. He could have instructed Patrick or Robert to handle the situation. Instead, he sat, inherited the acute discomfort of someone who had the means to act and had already chosen not to sooner. The pawn was on the boy's table. It was small. It was not, he realized, about pawns at all, but about the rules of the board. That night, when he went back to the office and paged through spreadsheets that suddenly felt petty, he did something he had not done before. He examined the healthcare plan his company offered not as an itemized benefit for employees, but as a moral ledger. It did not take long to see how gaps could exist and how those gaps would fall hardest on the people with the least flexibility. Margaret Chin's modeling had been precise. It had also been narrow in what it considered worth covering. He called Patricia. He asked for the clause numbers and the exact steps required to accelerate payment for a private hospital bill. Her voice, trained to manage legal exposure, came smooth and practical over the line. There were waivers that could expedite authorization, corporate funds that could be directed through emergency accounts. She suggested confidentiality and phrased remedies in neutral language that protected all parties. Daniel listened, half to instruction and half to an increasing sense of urgency that had nothing to do with risk management. He could have moved through conventional channels. He was accustomed to that sort of thing, formalities and memos and a path that preserved his reputation. He could have authorized a payment in ways that kept him anonymous, a philanthropist in a late-night headline. But the firing was public enough inside his building that a simple anonymous check felt like thimble-sized consolation. The discomfort it caused did not come from a fear of being exposed, but from a recognition that his earlier act, signing that termination, had consequences that his language of policy had not prepared him to regret. He found himself circling the chess motif in his mind, not for symbolism, but for the simple mechanics of care. A pawn could travel unexpectedly and become a piece of survival. A bishop could move obliquely. A king and queen could hold positions while the lesser pieces paid the cost. He thought of the board his decisions had created and how invisible pieces bore burdens because no one at the top bothered to look down to see them. After the first day, a message pinged on a private channel he used for crisis. If this affects staff of private households associated with your accounts, notify HR and legal. Discretion advised. Robert had already put the termination in motion, and now a ripple went through the system that required neat closure. Daniel felt the corporate reflex take over, but deeper than that, there was an itch he could not scratch with memos. He sat at his kitchen table and pushed a pawn across the grain of the wood, as if that motion could do anything, and then he put on shoes and left the penthouse. He did not go back to the hospital immediately. Instead, he paced the city in that interval, miles of glass and people moving, until the landscape of wealth felt small and absurd. He tasted guilt like cheap coffee. At a small coffee shop by the hospital, He hovered near a table where two teenagers argued over an unfinished chessboard, moving pieces with the confident chaos of youth. He could not remember the last time he'd actually played chess with another person. He had played in his head, with business moves and negotiating chips, but not with someone who would laugh or sulk after a misstep. An early CTA demanded itself in a story told like this, not as an interruption, but as an invitation. If this was resonating with someone watching, the narrator would have whispered, the right move was to stay with the story. The details would matter. So he sat there among the ordinary people, watching the teenagers play, feeling the world in novel angles. He went back to the hospital at dusk. The infusion center smelled of warm lotion and the fluorescent lullaby of machines. David, smaller now in a chair that had seemed too big earlier, tapped a pawn thoughtfully against a cup. He had a kind of pragmatic cheerfulness. He made small jokes about losing and winning as if life itself were a tournament he had enrolled in without permission. Rosa moved around him like the gravity of his life, protective, deliberate. When she traced her finger along the chessboard's edge, it was a gesture that read like a prayer. Daniel approached Rosa carefully. He did not apologize for the firing yet. That would have been clumsy and possibly performative. Instead, he listened, and listening, in a way he had never learned to, became its own contrition. She explained the cycles of appointments, the waiting for insurance companies to answer, the lateness of authorizations that delayed scans and consults. She spoke of nights at the hospital, where David slept on a folding cot and woke in the wrong hours. She spoke with matter-of-fact clarity about the math of survival. "You do our floors," Daniel said finally, because the absence of raw honesty would have ruined the possibility of anything else. He stopped being able to find a formulation that didn't spin out of control. "I signed your termination this morning," he said, and the words sounded like stone. The room did not tilt into melodrama. Instead, everything tightened around the admission. Rosa registered it without a show. She folded her hands over a cup, looked down at David, and said quietly, "I have done this work for years. I have fed my grandson with it. You pay me to do a job. I do my job." No one in that room sought spectacle. There were no recriminations. Rosa's dignity was a steady thing, not collapsing into plea nor swelling into triumph. She spoke with a plainness that left the shape of her life intact. She changed sheets and folded shirts and woke at dawn. She reminded him, without anger, of a simple fact. In a household that polished virtue onto its surfaces, the hand that wiped them clean counted on certain basic securities. She had lost one that morning, and it had consequences not just for her, but for the boy the world hadn't noticed. Daniel felt the corporate scaffolding of his decisions disassemble around him. He could not unsign what he'd signed. He could not erase the daily possibility that an error of judgment had deep human reverberations. He saw then how his role had not been to be a judge of small deviations, but to create a system that held people when the margins frayed. The thought made the room dizzy. He left without making promises. Promises were an easy currency. His life had been spent minting them, targets, market share goals, product launches. Instead, he asked where the family kept their chess set. David's fingers pointed to a worn box in a locker. Inside were mismatched pieces. Rosa pulled out one carved pawn and handed it to Daniel without ceremony. "Take it," she said. "Maybe you'll learn." The gesture was a small surrender of something she had kept tight, a passage of trust not for publicity but because, in that moment, she needed to believe someone had seen them. He took the pawn as if it were a password. It was warm from being held. It was nothing and everything, a token and an accusation. He slipped it into his pocket as if it had belonged there by right and walked back to the street in a twilight that felt like a verdict. That night he sat at his desk and didn't sleep. He had 100 ways to fix a problem he'd created with his signature, but none that admitted what he had not known before. The world on which his life was polished was held together by labor that received neither courtesy nor the emergency currency of empathy. He called James O'Caffer, his chief operating officer, not to brief him on logistics, but to ask a difficult, personal question. What if the systems we run don't look out for those who keep them running? James, the kind of person who had hearts in his inbox and empathy in his margins, listened and then agreed to look into the healthcare benefits his company offered to household staff connected to his operations. The conversation would for Daniel be a kind of reparative accounting. It was also the first time in years that he deliberately invited his executive team to consider a moral variable rather than a balance sheet one. Margaret and Robert would be annoyed. They would be practical. But Daniel could no longer separate being right from being human. He made a call to a number he rarely used, an old desktop line that Patricia had given him a decade prior for legal emergencies. He asked, in blunt terms, what it would take to unblock payment on David's immediate tests and consultants. He did not ask for a press release, he asked for efficacy. Patricia promised discretion and a path. He authorized a temporary coverage fund to be applied to the account so that treatments might begin while paperwork caught up. She told him the steps. He said do it with a voice that was both command and apology. Things moved with the peculiar speed of people who can pull levers. Privilege has logistics. Within 24 hours, an administrative hold was lifted. Notices arrived. A social worker called to say some of the scheduled tests could proceed while pending authorizations were in process. There was a relief in the room that made cooler air feel like grace. David's chair reclined. He let out a grin that felt for an instant like an answer. But the firing had already happened. The building had already signed and closed an envelope that changed Rosa's job status and her ability to schedule hours without a certain stability. Daniel found himself cursing the bureaucracy that had made a clean policy easier than an act of human consideration. The thing that hurt the most was not the cruelty that might have been intended, but the blindness that allowed him to do harm without seeing it. He arranged, without fanfare, for Rosa to keep working. Robert argued with him about proprieties and processes. Daniel insisted they simply make an exception and then take a longer look at the policy thread that allowed such exceptions to be necessary in the first place. Margaret asked what cost center to charge. He named his own. James promised to bring the question to HR in the morning meeting. Patricia logged the emergency payments and made sure everything would appear as a line item that legal could justify. Not because he cared about appearances, but because he cared for the work to sustain. Rosa accepted the arrangement with the same quiet that had defined her throughout. She did not make proclamations. She was practical, and from that practicality came a kind of armor. David would have treatment that week, his face lit with the small defiance of a boy with a stubborn passion for chess. The pawn in Daniel's pocket felt heavier now, full of the multiplied consequences of his choices. But the headline, the one that would later be stitched into the myth the tabloids could not resist, had already been planted in the soil of rumor. He fires her. The next day, the rumor would mutate. In the filtered world of social feeds and speculative articles, it would say more dramatic things, that the fired cleaner had turned the tables overnight, that a sudden acquisition of expensive property had been accomplished as a revenge snapshot of fortune. The world loved a quick moral arithmetic. Lost job, sudden money, instant reversal. It preferred crisp symmetry and the comfort of immediate justice. The truth was messier, and it would require a sequence of choices that neither of them had yet made. Daniel found himself thinking about mansions in a new way. He had always thought of them as architecture of distance, rooms to retreat into, glass to measure status. Now the idea of a house as something that could be given, shared, reimagined, kept intruding. It could be transfer, donation, settlement, community project, any of a dozen plausible mechanisms that would let the headline be true in a way that preserved dignity. He knew, with a clarity that felt like a promise or a threat, that whatever happened next would have to be crafted with care. At 2 a.m, he Googled terms he had never needed to know. Property transfer, deed, charitable trust. He read dry paragraphs about legal pathways and tax implications, all the while feeling the chessboard of his life rearrange itself. He thought of options, ways to make the idea of a mansion becoming someone else's home into an act of restitution rather than spectacle. He wrote down neat lists and then crossed them out. He had to be careful. he noted in the margins of his mind. Not to weaponize wealth for show, not to stage revenge, not to feed tabloids with a story that stripped Rosa of agency. There were routes he could imagine now, each plausible in a way that required further human choices, an offer of transfer or sale at symbolic price to provide Rosa and David stability, a community-led acquisition seeded by an anonymous donation, a legal settlement that compensated the damages of wrongful termination and enabled purchase, or a different coming together where the house became a shared community resource for families fighting similar battles. Each possibility had implications, and none would be undertaken lightly. Creative choice, indefinido. For now, the pawn in his pocket served as a reminder of vulnerability and as a kind of compact. He took it out and placed it on his work calendar as if a piece of carved wood could set priorities straight. He knew he had to change more than one line item. He would have to change a way of seeing. The next morning, the building hummed as if nothing had shifted. Meetings were held about expansion plans and market penetration. Margaret emailed a spreadsheet that began with projected impact. Robert circulated a memo that suggested new training modules for household staff. James convened an emergency HR review. The machinery of his world moved with the smoothness and denial of an organism that had never been hungry. But Daniel had tasted a new hunger. The desire to repair, not to repair reputation, but to repair reality. He began a quiet audit of the benefits, not to find a headline, but to find a way to keep a child like David from ever being a hidden variable in a company's calculations. He asked to meet with the hospital's social worker in the billing office to understand where policy ended and human need began. He began to imagine a policy that did not tolerate gaps for the people who cleaned the floors or prepared the meals in his world. Rosa went back to work that week, patched in through the quiet mechanics of someone bending policy to prevent immediate harm. She did not parade a resolution. She folded shirts and wiped down counters. David, on good days between appointments, taught other children in the infusion suite to move pawns across a makeshift board, explaining with a child's directness why a pawn who reaches the far side can become something more. The symbolism was not lost on anyone who wanted to see it. For David it was practical, a lesson about endurance, movement, and the possibility of new roles. At the end of that first week, Daniel did something he had not done the day he signed the severance package. He wrote Rosa a note. It was short, awkward, and human. He did not offer platitudes. He offered a meeting and an apology, the sincerity of which could not be measured by corporate metrics. He slid the note under the door of the staff room with a small envelope and a wooden pawn attached. It was an old gesture, painfully humble for a man who had never known how to be humble. When Rosa read it, she tucked the pawn into the inside pocket of her coat, as if it were a small talisman. She did not read it with victory or scorn. She read it as someone who had been seen, and being seen was sometimes as fragile and powerful as any legal remedy. That night, Daniel stood on the penthouse terrace and looked out over the city. Lights blinked like consolation prizes. He thought about the neat symmetry the world expected. He fires her. She buys his mansion. The crowd cheers. He thought about dignity. He thought about the slow dignity of people who did not require a spectacle to survive. He realized that if a mansion did change hands, it must do so as something that protected and empowered, not as a cataclysmic reversal meant for the headlines. He began to sketch in his head ways his company could protect people who did the invisible work of the visible world. He did not yet know whether a change in policy would be enough. He did not yet know whether his contrition could be genuine or performative. He only knew that the pawn's smooth surface had become heavy in his hand, and that he could no longer, in good conscience, move pieces without checking which pieces bore the burden. The story was only beginning to collect itself. The firing had occurred and the first steps toward repair had been taken. The city, with its rumbling subway and its urgent hospital corridors, continued to make demand of them both. Paths lay ahead that would either reweave a torn seam or leave it to fester. Daniel called Margaret and James to a private meeting and asked for a healthcare audit of the company's household-linked benefits. He asked Robert to pause any further terminations tied to clerical attendance without personal review. He asked Patricia for a review of settlement options that could provide immediate relief for families caught in the cracks. None of these actions repaired everything. They did, however, move the needle from private charity to an institutional response, something he had not known how to value before. He began to see, as clearly as if a light had been flipped on in a dusty room, that systems must be accountable, and that his signature had weight. Rosa continued to work, quietly resisting spectacle and retaining dignity. David kept playing chess with the steady determination of someone who had been taught to find patterns in small risk. The pawn remained with Daniel like a small, stubborn truth he could not return. They were not yet at the moment the tabloids would one day shout about. The mansion had not been bought. The firing was not yet fully repented. But the first moves had been made, awkward and human and real. And in a small hospital room earlier that week, a boy set the pawn in line with the pieces and announced, with the logic of a child who had not yet learned to curate sorrow, "If my pawn makes it to the other side, maybe I'll get to be queen." Perhaps, Daniel thought, if he learned how to be more than a man who moved pieces for profit, he might find a way to make that game fairer for more than just one pawn. He did not know what form that fairness would take. He only knew he had begun to learn the rules of a different kind of board. He moved from intention to choreography. Once the shock had settled into a kind of steady urgency, Daniel convened the meeting he had been avoiding. James at his side, Margaret with her spreadsheets reluctantly open, Robert clipped to the minutes, Patricia with an inked legal pad and a face that read consequences in neat lines. He did not begin with numbers. He began with the hospital room in his head. A small boy rolling a pawn, a woman who wore exhaustion like an old coat. "Start where policy meets people," he said, and the sentence landed like a new rule. Margaret asked about modeling. Robert asked about precedent. James asked the question that had been the hinge for Daniel's thinking. What would it take to make sure this can't happen again? Patricia scribbled potential legal frameworks and warned about exposure and liability. Daniel listened and then, for the first time in a long string of boardrooms, refused to let the conversation slide back into abstraction. He wanted practical steps, not platitudes. They set names to tasks that afternoon. HR would put a moratorium on terminations tied solely to clerical attendance in private household accounts until a proper review occurred. James would pilot an emergency healthcare fund for household-linked staff, seated by the corporate philanthropy line, and matched by discretionary executive funds. Margaret would run a model not just of costs, but of protective thresholds. How many families could be covered by what allocation, and for how long? Patricia would draft lawful pathways to accelerate payments, and to create a community trust where longer-term housing options could be held. Robert would be made responsible for implementing training that meant more than box-checking. Training that encouraged managers to ask privately and without judgment, "Is there anything else happening here we should know about?" The meeting produced a document with bullet points that could be read as a policy memo. And underneath it, like an urgent margin note in someone's handwriting, the thing that mattered. A decision that the company would act, immediately and quietly, to remove bureaucratic barriers for workers like Rosa. The energy in the room shifted. Anna, a mid-level legal analyst who reported to Patricia, later described the day as a kind of domino. Once the top piece fell, the rest moved by their own gravity. Daniel left the room with a list. He had until then hidden sensitivity behind process. Now he began to try to make sensitivity into process. At the hospital, the immediate things unspooled with an efficiency he had not expected. Under Patricia's direction, an emergency fund was authorized to release payments for David's pending tests and urgent consults. Margaret chartered a small team to audit household-linked benefits and propose structural changes. James set up a protocol to route any similar cases directly to a human review panel, rather than letting automated rules determine outcomes. Robert, who had been so procedural that his face rarely changed, came to the infusion suite with coffee and an apology that wasn't performative. He sat in a plastic chair and listened. The social worker, who had learned to hold tragic news with a patience honed by routine, managed the logistics. The clinic filed for the pre-authorization again, this time with a letter that made the human circumstances visible instead of burying them in codes. A consultant was scheduled. David began a sequence of treatments that, with time and luck, might move him toward remission. The word remission was used cautiously by doctors and never by those who loved him, without the awkward fear of tempting a fragile thing. At night, after the first flurry of coordination, Daniel found himself at the same coffee shop where he had watched teenagers move pieces across a cheap board. He had meant to meet James to go over budgetary impacts, but instead, he sat with the chessboard between them and let the simple ritual of moving pieces teach him something he hadn't admitted he needed to learn. He made poor moves at first, arrogant, unsubtle. But James, who was oddly skilled at letting lessons land by letting silence grow, made gentle suggestions and then allowed Daniel to fail. "If you only see pawns as expendable, you never play to actually win," James said. "You play to keep your top pieces safe." Daniel tasted the truth of that like a plucked string. Later that evening, when he slid the pawn he still carried across the table and into his palm, he felt less like a man summoning charity and more like someone beginning to understand obligation. Word drifted outward in ways neither of them intended. Inside the building, hushed conversations ran like loose thread through the staff rooms and the corridors. Outside, social media was a hungry engine. By the following morning, a rumor had taken a tidy shape, one that desired narrative neatness above nuance. Billionaire fires cleaner, cleaner buys mansion. The headline that would later congeal in tabloids had already started to appear as an overheated whisper. He could have let the rumor rot in its own bile. Instead, he decided to frame whatever move he made with intention, not spectacle. Patricia advised caution. Margaret worried about optics. Daniel, newly impatient with tidy images and public performance, asked instead, how to make a lasting change that lifted people rather than mere headlines. He decided to do both the quiet practical work of policy and a more visible act that would secure Rosa and others, without weaponizing his wealth for spectacle. In the privacy of their next meeting, he shared a set of possible paths he had spent the night drafting. Ways the mansion might be reimagined so that the headline's bluntness could be turned into something useful. He read them aloud as possible mechanisms: a direct transfer of title to Rosa, reparative transfer, a community acquisition fund seeded by corporate philanthropy and private donors, community acquisition, a retroactive settlement that included housing stipends, legal settlement, or a model where Rosa would be made steward of a property repurposed as temporary housing and support for families with children undergoing treatment, metaphorical buy. Each option existed within limits of law and needed close legal work. He marked these plans with a tag he knew would offend his instincts for certainty. Each was a creative choice, and certain steps were indefinito, until Patricia and the legal team could finalize the instruments. Patricia, who had been trained to think in precisely worded contingencies, approved of taking on the paperwork, but insisted on one condition. Rosa must be offered full agency to accept or decline any proposal. "This cannot be something we do to her," she said. "It must be something with her." Daniel accepted that constraint as a rectitude and as a test. If this was going to be meaningful, Rosa had to be the one to decide what she would do with security. He did not speak to the press. Instead, the company quietly seeded the emergency health fund and authorized a discreet transfer of funds to the clinic to cover immediate needs. People at the hospital cried in small private ways, donations arriving without fanfare, authorization phoned in by Patricia's team. A nurse allowed overtime paid for by a corporate line item. It looked on the surface like the mechanics of leverage. He had pushed buttons that could be pushed, but it looked like much more to those who were near the boy's bed. It looked like a hand removing a rock that had been pressing down on someone for too long. Rosa continued to come to work. She continued to fold shirts with the same pragmatic dignity she had always shown. She did not look for favors or display gratitude in a way that would have flattened her into a caricature. When Daniel entered the staff room to ask if she would meet him for a conversation, she accepted, but did not seem surprised. She had, she said, ways of living that required no spectacle. They met in a small side office with a kettle on and a stack of takeout boxes on a side table. Informal, nearly ridiculous for a man who lived in glass and curated absence. Daniel tried first, and awkwardly, to apologize for the firing. The words felt thin, but they carried an honesty that had not been present when he had signed the document. "I should have known," he said. "I should have looked." Rosa did not accept an apology as currency. She listened and then, in the double focus of someone accustomed to holding difficulties, told him what she needed. Security, she said simply. A place where she could breathe without the ledger of next month's rent at her back. A way for David not to wake up wondering if a test could be delayed because someone hadn't signed an authorization. She did not ask him to empty his pockets in a way that would humiliate him. She asked for structural protections. He offered clumsily some of the options his legal team had sketched. He explained he had asked for a community acquisition plan that would allow a property to be purchased and used as temporary housing and support for families in the same situation. He explained it could be immediate, or it might require more planning. He said he wanted Rosa to have final say. Rosa considered him. She folded the edge of her scarf and didn't hold his gaze the way a person ready to be photographed might. Finally, she said, "If a house is to be for people like my family, then I want it to be for people like my family, not for me to sit in it alone." It was not the response of a woman seeking revenge. It was, instead, the answer of someone who understood what stability did to a life. She would be both steward and resident, she said. She would not be an ornament in a story. She would run the place, help other families, and make rules that recognized dignity. Daniel felt relief that was not performative. He felt the slow birth of something that might, if they did it well, be useful. They agreed to try the community acquisition path, with one important caveat. Rosa's name would be on the deed if she wished, but the property would be held in a community trust that prioritized families with medical need. Funds to enable the purchase would be assembled through a combination of corporate seed donations and a coalition of private donors whom Daniel contacted through channels meant for philanthropy. The purchase would be arranged with care to ensure legal transparency and tax compliance. Because the timetable to get people into safety was immediate, Patricia and her team agreed to expedite closing processes, subject to necessary legal reviews, while ensuring all steps were above board. This selection, the choice to seed a fund and set up a trust that would allow the mansion to be acquired and stewarded by Rosa, was a creative path and thus marked as creative choice indefinito in Daniel's notes. It meant that some details, exact timing of funds, legal contingencies, remained to be formalized. It also meant that the next steps would be public enough that the rumor mills might interpret them as a tabloid-ready reversal, regardless of the careful intentions behind it. On paper, it was a messy, bureaucratic solution. In person, the change came quickly. Patricia reached out to a select group of donors and to an old colleague at a community foundation. Margaret unlocked corporate philanthropy lines to provide an initial sum to get the acquisition to contract stage. James met with community leaders to design programming for the house, beds for families, counseling rooms, a small clinic partnership for follow-up care. Local legal teams volunteered pro bono to run title searches and clear encumbrances. Within a day, remarkably, disconcertingly fast, an agreement was reached with the owner of an adjacent property that allowed for the mansion's sale at a price negotiated to facilitate the trust's mission. The speed of the transaction was not magic. It was a sequence of deliberate privileges, contacts who moved quickly because they could, lawyers who prioritized pro bono work, and a seller who agreed to a reduced time frame because they wanted to see the property serve a different purpose. And most of all, it was the work of people who decided that bureaucracy would be used to protect rather than to pit lives against each other. Still, Patricia wrote in her notes the word indefinito next to the final signatures. Finer legal points to be clarified, taxes to be arranged, fiduciary structures to be finalized. The next day, a day that would lend itself to the tidy headline, the papers were signed. The image that would be flattened into gossip was more complex in life. Rosa went to the signing not as a triumphant sleight of hand, but with a quietness that made ceremonial moments feel awkward. She wore a plain coat, and the scarf that still smelled faintly of her son's cologne. Daniel went not as a man wanting to be thanked, but as someone who needed to witness the act of handing over responsibility with humility. Patricia sat beside them, legal instruments arranged and explained, a careful steward ensuring the transfer would be lawful. When they arrived at the title company's small conference room, the air smelled of paper and beans from a nearby bakery. A small cluster of community representatives and legal counsel were present. The trust's charter had already been drafted to specify that the house, once purchased, would be managed with an advisory board including hospital social workers, community leaders, and Rosa as lead steward if she chose. The paperwork allowed Rosa to become the named purchaser with the funds coming from the newly created community trust, and it included the mechanism for the trust to reimburse the initial donors over time through philanthropic arrangements. The arrangement made her name a factual line on a deed and made the house a community resource. "Do you want your name on the deed?" Patricia asked, not unkindly, when the signatures were being prepared. Rosa paused. The question carried a weight more complex than legal ownership. It asked whether she wanted visibility, responsibility, and the burden that sometimes comes with being the face of something others had made possible. "If they are buying it for us," she said in the soft way she had, "then put my name there, but let it be for everyone like us, and do not make it about me." So she signed. Her pen scratched, deliberate and small, across the page. The deed bore her name as purchaser. The legal line that parsed the transaction explained the source of funds and the trust's mission. The transfers were lawful and intentional, with the caveat that some tax filings and long-term fiduciary arrangements remained to be finalized. Patricia noted them as indefinido. In a log she planned to complete that week. In the short version that Twitter and certain columns preferred, the story telescoped into a neat poetic reversal. She buys his mansion the next day. In the lived version, a complex choreography had made that sentence possible. Privilege redirected, lawyers keeping watch, community leaders agreeing to steward public purpose, a woman asked to accept responsibility she did not want for show, but accepted to protect others. For Rosa, the house was not a palace to be occupied for ostentation. It became, almost at once, the kind of place she described: beds for families who had their nights broken by hospital hallways, rooms for counseling, a small kitchen where volunteers could prepare food for parents who slept between treatments. David liked to sit in a windowed room that looked out at trees and played chess with a volunteer who had been a college club champion before life bent him to other things. He brought his worn pawn and placed it on an improvised board in the mansion's small parlor and declared it, with the clarity of a child given reasons to hope, that his pawn had reached the other side. The mansion's foyer had a giant chessboard painted into the tile. Someone had insisted on the motif, and David put his pawn at its corner as if to claim the whole board. Visitors would later remark on how appropriately symbolic it felt. Later, the board would be photographed and simplified into an image that lived on social feeds. The complexity behind the scenes would be invisible to those who preferred a quick moral arc. But within the house, the gesture felt right. A boy who had been boarded by illness placing a piece in a place meant for play, and for strategy, and implicitly, for life. Daniel watched the first families arrive. He watched Rosa meet them and guide them around a house she had not picked to be her own in any conventional sense. He watched David show other children how a pawn could become a queen if it persevered. The words were literal, not metaphored. He watched nurses and social workers bring in baskets of clothing and soft toys, and a list of families who needed temporary shelter while their children were in treatment. He watched his own signature on the deeds and felt, for once, that it was an instrument for something that would not be reduced to his image. He did not stand at the door of the mansion like a benefactor at a ribbon cutting. He parked in an unobtrusive lane and walked in behind a woman bringing bedding from a donation van. He stood then, awkward, new to the role, and Rosa found him in the parlor. She did not smile the way someone obliged by gratitude might. She simply nodded and then handed him a broom. "Sweep," she said, handing him the broom as if she were making an order at work. "We have guests coming." He laughed at the ordinariness of it and swept, and it felt less like penance and more like participation. The company's reforms continued. The emergency fund was formalized into a standing program for household-linked staff. HR instituted a requirement that any termination for household staff linked to company accounts required direct review by a human panel. Margaret's models were expanded to include human risk factors and the cost of instability, not only the line items of insurance premiums. Robert traveled to the hospital not as a messenger of policy, but to see the work being done, and he came back to the office and changed the tone of his memos. James convened a group of community leaders to help run a program inside the mansion that provided transitional housing and logistical support for families like Rosa's. Patricia oversaw the trust and remained precise and insistently wary of the way symbolic acts can calcify into PR. David's treatments went on in the way treatments do, with good days and difficult ones. The doctors were cautiously optimistic. There were moments of promising numbers and times of frustrating plateaus. The family learned the rhythms of hair loss and regrowth, of fatigue and small triumphs. There were hospital nights in which the mansion's small bedrooms became sanctuaries. There were mornings in which Rosa brewed coffee for parents in a kitchen that smelled of cinnamon and hope, and handed out cards listing local resources. The house did not cure everything, and in the most important way, no one claimed it did. Rather, it made endurance less solitary, and made the system that had once abandoned them a little less indifferent. The chess motif, quiet and persistent, threaded through the months. David taught Rhoda clinical volunteers simple openings. Rosa would sit at the edge and comment on how patient moves could win the game. Daniel, who had once measured risk only in spreadsheets, found himself accepting an invitation to sit at a small folding table in the mansion's rec room and learn to play not as a conqueror, but as a student. He made bad moves and, occasionally, a clever sacrifice. He learned, slowly, the humility intrinsic to the game. A player can be brilliant and still fail to anticipate a human variable. A particularly slow winter evening found him sitting on the mansion's back terrace with a cup of tea that wasn't as precise as the drinks he usually drank. The city slept under a low cloud. The chessboard on the terrace, painted into a table's surface, caught reflected light as if it were a map. Rosa came out with a blanket draped over her shoulders. David had slipped out behind her, carrying the old pawn that had started this whole complicated set of motions. He walked over, climbed onto the same chair he had once sat in at the clinic, and placed the pawn carefully in the center of the board. "You keep this," Rosa told Daniel, gesturing to the pawn. "It reminded you. But you will also come here with us sometimes." He took it and felt the groove in its base, smooth from fingers and time. "I will," he said, and the sentence was neither proclamation nor pride. It was a commitment measured in small movements. In the months that followed, the company tracked new metrics and different ones. Turnover for household staff decreased. Emergency fund disbursements were logged not as charity, but as retention and dignity measured. The trust's legal filings remained under Patricia's steady watch. Newspapers ran different lines, some triumphant, some cynical. People on social feeds reduced lives to one-sentence summaries. Internally, the work was granular, often tedious, and utterly necessary. There were times when the weight of what he'd done returned to Daniel like a physical ache. He was haunted by the image of the severance packet and the brown paper box with its hand-tied string. He could not, in good conscience, say that everything was redeemed. He had been cruel by inattentiveness and fortunate by circumstance. He tried not to conflate the two. Instead, he let the work he had set in motion be the measure of his contrition. David, when his hair grew back in thin curls, one afternoon surprised a volunteer by beating him in a rapid game. He laughed like a boy whose capacity for joy had been enlarged by small victories. Rosa, when she had a quiet minute between admissions and arranging volunteers, taught other parents how to make empanadas in the mansion's kitchen, humming instructions that sounded like prayer in motion. The house filled, not with the opulence tabloids imagined, but with people who carried daybooks of grief and of resilience. As months made years, the mansion became less a story about one man's error and more a community touchstone. It sheltered parents between shifts, offered quiet places for teenagers to do homework, while a parent sat in a clinic room, and hosted support groups organized by nurses who had for years seen families fall through cracks. It didn't erase systemic failures, but it created a small network that softened the worst edges. One afternoon, Daniel found himself called to the hospital for an update on internal policy impacts. He expected a routine report. Instead, he was led down to the infusion suite, where a small table had been set up with a chessboard. A child he hadn't met before sat with pieces lined up, and around them were parents who smiled at him. Not out of gratitude exactly, not with that transactional face, but with something like recognition. David, older now, had given a talk to a small group of volunteer tutors about what the mansion meant. He said, in a voice that was sure and soft, that a pawn could reach the other side. He said he had wanted that for himself, not because he desired crowns, but because he wanted to know that movement mattered. He explained plainly that the pawn lesson was not about changing your piece, but about the chance to become something more, because someone had cleared a path. When the talk finished, David walked up and presented Daniel with a new pawn. It was carved from a different wood, smooth and unvarnished, as if it had never been in the hands of a child before. "For you," he said. "So you remember the board." Daniel accepted it like a medal he had not earned but had been given responsibility to protect. He placed it in his pocket and felt the small, familiar weight. Years later, when the trust was well established and had added another house to its network, the mansion had become a place with a steady staff and an advisory board that included Rosa as a member. She had refused to be its public face in press bulletins, but she had allowed herself to be its heart. She occasionally rented out a room for privacy and tended a small garden by the North Drive. On certain evenings, she would sit on the back terrace and play a sloppy, sweet game of chess with a neighbor who had been her daughter's childhood friend, laughing in a manner she had always reserved for people she loved. Daniel, in the more private places of his life, had shed some of his old armor. He still navigated spreadsheets and numbers. He still had to answer to shareholders and markets. But the ledger he kept at home was different. He measured not only growth, but margin of safety for families whose labor kept offices running. He created a stewardship committee at the company that reviewed benefits not as expense lines, but as obligations, and he made room in his calendars for hospital visits that were not photo ops. There were critics, those who said his actions were publicity, others who said they didn't go far enough. There were board meetings with sharp, skeptical faces, but there were also children who learned to move pawns, and parents who slept in a real bed instead of a hospital chair. Those were the measurable things that mattered to Rosa and to the people who frequented the mansion's kitchen in the middle of the night. One spring afternoon, the kind of day that made the city smell like new green leaves, Daniel climbed the mansion's back steps and found the terrace populated by familiar figures. A chess club had gathered, nurses, parents, volunteers, and a few local politicians who had come because they had heard that a house was being run in a new way. David, taller now, and with his father's laugh somewhere in his mouth, sat at the corner table and made a move that made his opponent smile. Rosa stood at the threshold and watched. The sun caught the edges of her hair. She had a quietness about her that suggested a life reorganized to protect the things that mattered. Daniel walked over and without fanfare sat across from her. They took up a small game, simple and unhurried. He made a clumsy opening. She countered with a move both kind and firm. At the center of the table, the pawn rested where David had placed it years earlier, a small object that had become larger than itself. It had traveled, in a way, across different kinds of boards. The office board where pieces were livelihoods, the hospital board where moves were about time, and this domestic board where people changed the rules themselves. "You asked me to be a steward," Rosa said, not as accusation but as fact. "You asked me if I wanted my name on the deed. And you wanted it not for yourself but for others," he said. She regarded him and then, briefly, the city beyond. If by buying a house a person can make a place where other people do not have to be alone in their worst hours, then it is worth it, she said. He nodded. They both understood that nothing they had done would be enough to close every gap. Systems would continue to strain and sometimes to fail. But they had, together and imperfectly, shifted a pattern. When a person at the top saw the board, the play could be changed. The pawn between them was ordinary and stubborn. Daniel picked it up and rolled it between his fingers. He felt the groove again and thought of all the small things that had led to that table. A fired worker, a messy signature, a hospital corridor, a child's grin, a lawyer's prudence, and a community's willingness to respond. Outside, the city moved with its ordinary indifference. Inside, people made food and mended sheets. The mansion had become a place where the architecture of distance was repurposed into a shelter of proximity. It was not perfect. It was human. If the tabloid version of the story wanted a neat moral, man sinned, woman triumphed, justice served in a single day, it would not find it here. What existed was less tidy and more durable. A woman who had been fired by a system not looking, and who, with agency and quiet resolve, helped transform a mansion into a refuge. The buy in the headline had been enabled by people with power choosing to do something different with that power, and it had been accepted by Rosa on terms that preserved her dignity and centered community benefit. The words creative choice and indefinido might have appeared in legal notebooks to indicate creative steps and unresolved particulars, but in the living room by the fireplace, what counted was the warmth. Months later, when David's hair had regrown and he sat at a chessboard in a school library tutoring kids in openings, someone asked him what he would tell a person who was about to make a large decision in their life. He looked at the question as if it were a game move, considered it, and then said simply, "Look down." Those two words, "look down," meant 1,000 things to the people who had watched a house change hands and a company make policy shifts, and a boy find the space to be a boy. They meant seeing the people whose labor made other people's lives possible. They meant reading policy with an eye toward the smallest consequences. They meant that when a person with means acted, they might act to widen the table rather than to sharpen the edge that divided them. As for Daniel, he kept the pawn on his desk in a small wooden bowl with other pieces he had collected from ordinary places. A chipped mug someone had left behind in a staff room, a child's drawing taped to his monitor. Those things were reminders. They were not absolution. They were compass points. He had, in the end, learned a different measure of success, the kind that asks not what you have avoided losing, but what you have given to secure someone else's foothold. If this story stayed with you, if the idea of companies protecting the people who keep their worlds tidy matters to you, please share what you think in the comments. What is the one small change you would ask of the leaders in your life? And wherever you are, look down once in a while. The board below you might be full of pawns,